Hey guys, today's video lecture topic is going to be cells, the basic unit of life. Please make sure you are filling in your notes organizer as I go through the video. I'm going to go very quickly at the end through the cell structures, so if you need any information, you can pause, you can rewatch as many times as you need to. Okay, so today's topic is cells, the basic unit of life. The definition of a cell is right here in italics. Cells are the smallest unit of life that is classified as a living thing. So the smallest thing that can be considered living is something made up of a single cell. So in other words, the cell is a basic structural, functional, and biological unit of all organisms. They are called the building blocks of life. Remember, atoms are the building blocks of matter. Cells are the building blocks of organisms, of life. Let's talk a little bit about the discovery of cells, the history of cells. In 1665, Robert Hooke was the first person to give cells a name. He actually viewed cork underneath a microscope, which is dead plant cells, and here is a picture of what he saw. This is his drawing. And he gave them the name cellulae, which means small rooms. And he actually named them because he thought they looked like the little small rooms of a prison. So prison cells really is where this comes from. In 1683, a guy named Anton von Leeuwenhoek was the first person to view living organisms underneath a microscope, and he actually took a sample of pond water. So, everyone thought water wasn't living, that, you shouldn't be able to see anything but water inside of pond. So he took a sample of pond water, put it underneath a microscope, and he saw that it was full of living organisms. He saw things moving and realized that there were even organisms that you couldn't see with the naked eye, the importance of the microscope. Okay, in 1838 and 1839, we had these two guys that were studying different types of organisms. Matthias Schleiden was studying plants, and he looked at all sorts of different plants and realized that no matter what type of plant he was viewing underneath the microscope, they all were made up of cells. So he concluded that all plants are made up of cells. And then in 1839, a guy named Theodor Schwann realized that no matter what animal he looked at, they were all made of cells. So he concluded that every animal in the world was made up of cells. And these two guys were actually friends, and they were having tea together one day, and Schleiden said, you know what, all plants are made up of cells. And Schwann said, well, you know what, all animals are made up of cells. And that led them to develop these fundamental ideas called the cell theory. So the three statements that make up the cell theory is that all living things are composed of one or more cells. We know that, right? That's a characteristic of life. Cells are the basic unit of structure of living things, so the basic unit of life. And then cells can only come from pre-existing cells. They cannot spontaneously generate from nowhere. They can only come from other cells by passing genetic information from one generation to the next. So pause if you need to. Make sure you have all the contributions for all the scientists and the three parts of the cell theory. Remember, make sure you have your notes organizer completely filled out, every single part, if you want to use it for the homework check. Okay. Hopefully this is a review, but there are two types of cells, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. The prokaryotic cells are the most basic and ancient type of cell. So they're a primitive cell that lacks a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. It doesn't have any of those fancy cell parts. It doesn't have a nucleus. It doesn't have the little organelles. It's very, very simple. The only type of organism that is prokaryotic is bacteria. That is number 6 on your notes organizer. And you are going to hear me say that 10 million times this year. The only type of prokaryotic organism is bacteria. Everything else is eukaryotic. Prokaryotic, bacteria only. Everything else, eukaryotic. And eukaryotic is the more advanced cell type. These cells have a nucleus, and they have those fancy membrane-bound organelles, those fancy cell parts. Everything except for bacteria is eukaryotic. So protists, fungi, plants, animals, all of their cells have a nucleus and those membrane-bound organelles. Now, how did that happen? How did we go from having all prokaryotic cells to the development of the very first eukaryotic cells? Well, we have a theory that explains that. It's called the Endosymbiotic Theory. And this explains the origin of eukaryotic cells, where eukaryotic cells came from. So the idea says that at one time, all we had were prokaryotic cells. We had big ones, we had little ones, we had medium-sized ones. And the Endosymbiotic Theory says that at one point, a larger prokaryotic cell, so remember prokaryotic is bacteria, so a larger bacteria cell engulfed a smaller prokaryotic cell, and they started living and growing and dividing as if they were one single organism. They started living in a symbiotic relationship and then eventually dividing in a way so that the little prokaryotic cells are what we think became things like the mitochondria or the chloroplast or even the nucleus. We think that those little prokaryotic cells are what became our fancy organelles and our eukaryotic cells. And there's a lot of evidence that supports that. The mitochondria, for example, has its own DNA. So it's completely separate from the DNA found in the nucleus. So that sort of supports the idea that at one point it was its own separate living organism. Okay, two terms you should be familiar with, unicellular and multicellular. Unicellular is just like what it sounds. It's an organism that consists of one single cell. All bacteria are unicellular. All prokaryotic cells are unicellular. But there are some protists that are unicellular, like the amoeba and the paramecium, and then some fungi like yeasts that are unicellular. Multicellular just means that the organism consists of many cells, more than one cell. All multicellular organisms are going to have eukaryotic cells. All animals are multicellular. All plants are multicellular. Most fungi are multicellular, and then some protists are multicellular. Okay, there are different structures for the different cell types. A bacteria cell is going to be different from a plant cell, is going to be different from an animal cell. So we're going to talk about some of those defining features of each type of cell, and then we'll get into the details of each cell structure in just a second. So the unique structures in a bacteria cell, remember these are prokaryotic, right? The only type of prokaryotic organism is bacteria. So they have an outer cell wall, they have an inner cell membrane, they do not have a nucleus, right? That's why they're prokaryotic, and they do not have membrane-bound organelles, and their DNA is not contained in anything because they don't have a nucleus, so it's just free-floating. So make sure under bacteria cell in all capital letters you write prokaryotic. Okay, the plant cell, and I have a lovely plant cell model right here. So a plant cell has some unique characteristics. It has an outer cell wall. This is what gives plant cells their very rigid shape. They still have a cell membrane, but the outer layer is a cell wall. They have chloroplasts, which is where photosynthesis takes place, and that's these little green things here. And then most plant cells have a very large central vacuole. This particular model has some smaller ones, but those are used for storage. So those are some defining features of plant cells. Is this a prokaryotic or eukaryotic type of cell? It's got a nucleus. It's got fancy cell parts, which means it is eukaryotic. Write that in all capital letters under plant cell. And then an animal cell's defining features is going to be that the outer layer is the cell membrane. This is why animal cells are more flexible. And then they also have organelles called lysosomes, which we'll talk more about in a second. So animal cells, of course, are eukaryotic. They have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. I keep using that term organelle. Let's define that. What is an organelle? Organelle literally means tiny organ, and that's exactly what they are. Every organ in your body has a specific function. Every organelle in a cell has a specific function. So there are these differentiated structures within a cell parts in other words, that perform different jobs. And now we're going to get into the details of the different organelles, so make sure you fill in this chart. I'm going to go quickly through this. This should be a refresher for you, so if you need to pause and rewatch it anytime, please do. The nucleus is the most important organelle of all in a eukaryotic cell. This controls all of the cell's activities. We call it the brain of the cell. And that is because this is where you're going to find your genetic information. And that genetic information, DNA, is what carries the instructions for life. So eukaryotic cells are going to have a nucleus. Animals and plants on your little list there. Cell membranes. Cell membranes are semi-permeable, which means they can control, they only let certain things in and out, right? They don't just let anything in and out. That's what semi-permeable means. It's a semi-permeable double layer that surrounds the cell. This is the bouncer of the cell. The bouncer controls who goes in and out of the club, right? The cell membrane controls what goes in and out of the cell. It makes sure that only good things are coming in and waste and bad things are going out. Every single cell has a cell membrane. Every cell, because every cell needs to be able to control what goes in and out of the cell. So bacteria, animal, and plant, every single thing on that list there. Okay, the cell wall. When you hear cell wall, we typically think of plant cells because it's a defining feature of plant cells. It's what gives it its rigid shape, but there are other organisms that have cell walls as well. So plant cell walls are composed of cellulose. We've talked about that before. They are what provide plants and other organisms with protection and structure. That's why plants can stand upright. Plant cells have cell walls, obviously. Bacteria cells have cell walls, but they also have cell membranes. Don't get confused and think it's either one or the other. Okay, the chloroplast, and again, those are the little green things on my model here. The chloroplast is where photosynthesis takes place. So the function of the chloroplast is the function of photosynthesis. So make sure you write down that the function of the chloroplast is to take energy from the sun and use it to make food for the plant, and that food for the plant is in the form of glucose, which is a sugar. That is the job of the chloroplast. So you will find chloroplast obviously in plant cells, and you're actually going to get to look at some of those underneath the microscope. Okay, the cytoskeleton. The word part cyto means cell, and you know what a skeleton is, right? We have an internal skeleton. So this is the skeleton of the cell. It's a network of these structures called microtubules that provide support and give structure to the cell. Now, every cell has a cytoskeleton, right? Some sort of structure to it. But in eukaryotic cells, it is going to be much more complex. But every cell does have a cytoskeleton. Okay, next up we have the Endoplasmic Reticulum, sometimes called the ER. This is the highway of the cell. Think about what the highway is used for. It's used to, for materials to travel along it, to be transported. So the endoplasmic reticulum is used for carrying proteins and other materials from one part of the cell to another. There is smooth ER and there is rough ER, and the difference is whether or not it has ribosomes attached to it. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum does not have any ribosomes attached. It's smooth. The rough endoplasmic reticulum does. So the little ribosomes literally make it bumpy. That's why it's called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. The Golgi Apparatus, sometimes called the Golgi body, sometimes called the Golgi complex. Many names, one job. It's an organelle that's often found near the nucleus, and it is used for packaging and transport of materials out of the cell. If you see that word packaging, that is like the buzzword for Golgi body or for Golgi apparatus. It's used for packaging and transport. We call this the post office or the FedEx of the cell. So Golgi apparatus and endoplasmic reticulum are both found in eukaryotic cells. They are a eukaryotic cell organelle, so we're talking animal and plant, not bacteria. Okay, lysosomes. These are organelles that contain digestive enzymes. We know what enzymes are, right? They're used for speeding up reactions. So in this case, they're going to be used for speeding up digestion of old cell parts. So lysosomes are the garbage trucks of the cell. They're used to break down old worn out parts and waste products found in the cell so that they can be sent on their way outside of the cell. These are unique to animal cells. Plant cells have different ways of getting rid of waste, but lysosomes, these particular organelles, are going to be found in animal cells. Okay, next up we have the mitochondria. Hopefully you've heard of the mitochondria before. Everyone learns mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, the mighty mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. It is called that because it provides the cell with energy. So it produces energy through the process of cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. So it takes food and breaks it down to produce energy. Instead of taking energy and using it to produce food, we're taking food and breaking it down to produce energy. And that is happening inside of the mitochondria. The mitochondria is a eukaryotic organelle, so it is found in animals and plants. Okay, the ribosomes are these tiny little organelles that produce proteins. Here's how I remember that. I love ribs. I love barbecue ribs, right? Ribosome starts with the word rib. When I eat a rib, I'm getting lots and lots of protein. So ribosomes produce protein. Some ribosomes are found free floating in the cell, not attached to anything. And then remember, other ribosomes are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. The proteins can travel all up and down the ER. So the job of the ribosome is to produce protein. Every cell has ribosomes. Every single cell, bacteria, plant, and animal. They are not fancy membrane-bound organelles. They're literally jumbled up proteins making more protein. So every cell has ribosomes. The vacuole is a storage structure found in plant cells. This is what allows plants to stand upright. When the vacuole is empty, that's why plants start to droop. Okay, so it's used for storage, typically storing water found in plant cells. And then finally, the cytoplasm is the gel-like substance found in all cells. And that's it for today.